Welcome to Go For Side Effects. I'm your host, Kevin Simon. You're on with co-host John. John, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. Well, thank you.
And Sarah, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
All right. And we have Dr. Golumb on tonight. And, we're going to be going over, we're going to keep this about 30 to 45 minutes because I definitely for sure. And Dr. Golumb, how are you doing?
I am doing fine. Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
I love having you on. I think you're the only researcher that keeps coming back on. And so I love it. I do. Whenever I talk about researching and stuff, I do feel that, there's, to me, only a few that really care and, and want to figure out what is going on with us Desert Storm vets and the Gulf War vets.
Right.
And so, but before we start, I forgot to bring this up last time. I want everybody to know that we just got on Patreon. Go up there, look up Go For Side Effects and everything. And, for $1 a month, you can catch all the after the show shows. And if you want to catch the latest episodes before they come out, you can also do that. And also, let everybody know the tape we did with the last 2 weeks on Schwarzkopf's interview with all of us. Next Friday, it will be out on YouTube and Patreon. We can't put it on every single one out there because, it's too much work. That's how I look at it. But I want to get into this. And Dr. Golumb?
Yes.
Okay, so earlier I was wondering about, there's a couple of topics I would really like to talk about. And I know I've already brought them up to you before, so if you want to dig in on what you've been doing right now and helping us, and
great.
The floor is all yours.
Okay, well, we have a lot of studies in different stages, a couple that are wrapping up right now. Our membrane findings are looking like they're blockbuster. There's huge differences in our analyses, and I probably shouldn't be talking about it too much before it goes to publication, but let's just say that the characteristics of membranes in Gulf War veterans are very different from those in healthy controls, and we have identified a way that might make a really, really big difference to the veterans, and we sent off our gene expression tubes for analysis. So what is gene expression? So we know that when people have different genes, that can lead to different outcomes. Like the people that have the gene variants for detoxifying sarin and that were bad at detoxifying sarin and who were exposed to sarin have higher rates of illness. But that same enzyme that's involved in detoxifying sarin, which is called PON1 or peroxidase, two people can have the same gene, but they can have different levels of expression. And that enzyme, PON1, enzymes are proteins that do an action. And so when there are low levels of that enzyme that does an action helping to detoxify sarin, then even if two people have the same genes, when one has low levels because of low gene expression, they can have very different outcomes. So we've got the gene expression data that has gone off to the lab that then figures out, what the levels of expression of the different genes are, and then we're about ready to come back and analyze those results. So that's kind of exciting. And then we have our physician attitude study still going on. I think we need about 50 more people to get the 325 that we're looking for. So we're hoping that if people had experiences with their healthcare providers in the VA is where we've often heard about it, because a lot of people get their care from a VA. And if they have things they want to say about what those experiences were like, we want to hear from you. And that survey study collects information about people's worst experience, their best experience, and some people say they don't have a best experience, and their most recent experience, and then looks at how those experiences influence important things. Like people tell us, gee, I had this terrible experience, and then I didn't come back for care for any of my medical problems for, X number of years, or I didn't return to that doctor or that healthcare facility, or, didn't trust the doctor or didn't take my other medicine. So there are real consequences of having providers that treat patients badly and also that treat patients well. So we're trying to collect both of those sides of the story, and then basically be able to give out the message about how providers need to be treating Gulf War veterans. And then we are finishing up our genetic study that is going to greatly build on our past smaller genetic study that is going to look at how multiple different biological processes that we think are involved in Gulf War illness play in. So we already know from work by Lee Steele and Robert Haley that the gene variants of the enzymes that clear the specific toxins are very important. If you couldn't clear the toxin well, then you're more likely to be ill. And I'll pat myself on the back by saying that back in the 1990s in work I did for RAND, I said we have to look at those gene variants and I predicted specifically that the butyrylcholinesterase for PB and the PON1 for organophosphates would be important, and they both look like they are. But we also have a paper that's in review right now, so I should be careful how much I say about it, that looks a little bit at the mitochondrial genome. So mitochondria are the energy powerhouses of your cells, and they are they have their own genome that you inherit only from your mother. This is different from the double helix DNA that we all learned about in school that you inherit from both parents. So they have little circular genomes, genetic material, kind of like bacteria do. And in fact, the leading belief in science is that they started out as a bacterial type organism that fused with a nucleated cell, and then they evolved together where these basically colonies of bacterial-like mitochondria serve the cell energy functions of the cell. And their genetic material... Go ahead.
Well, so Dr. Golumb, so as our listeners are as most all of, if not all of us, have a real hard time with fatigue.
Yeah, so okay. Yeah, thank you for bringing me back to reality. Okay, mitochondria, energy powerhouses, they have their own genes. We think those genes are also important. You inherit them only from your mother, and it looks like they are important. I'll just say that. And so our current genetic study, people give a cheek swab, and it goes off for analysis, and it's whole genome analysis, including both the double-strand DNA that you inherit from both parents and also the DNA that you inherit only from your mom that comes in these little energy powerhouses. So I guess that's the sort of short way of saying that one.
So what you're saying is that the moms have more energy than the dads.
That may be true, but the moms are the only ones that you inherit these mitochondria and their DNA from. Usually, I think that, just to make things complicated, there's at least one reported case where a kid has a mitochondrial genetic defect that is identical to their dad's, and they think that somehow the sperm had a mitochondrion and brought it into the egg. But almost always it's just from the mom.
That's interesting.
So you have mitochondria just like your mom does, if you're male or female, but you only pass them on through the egg and not through the sperm.
Well, that's interesting.
So, would that mean, Dr. Golumb, would that mean then with our female service member group being demographic, there's a higher potential for risk of damage with those mitochondrial genomes?
That's a super good question, and the answer is probably in terms of the impact on the offspring. Both men and women would probably have similar chance of damaging the genetics, but only the mom would have the chance to pass on that particular problem to the offspring.
Okay, so kind of like with some of these children, the babies that are suffering from that we think that is caused from us coming back from the war.
Right.
And we're able to pass it, like I was able to pass it on maybe to my wife. And then she would then pass it on to the children, correct?
Yep.
I learned something today.
Well, so the way that can happen, it turns out, and I think I only learned this recently, that sperm can sometimes carry chemical into the egg. So that's one way that, that chemical can be sort of passed on. I will say that veterans can also pass chemical to their wives in other ways. And one of those ways is through laundry. And we've had a couple of veterans say, oh, gee, we've still got our NBC suits. Do you want them for testing? So those have been sitting around for 34 years, in somebody's closet. And whatever that chemical is, it has been, following what's called the concentration gradient, leaving the garment and getting on whatever is around it. And then,
would you be able to extract that from an NBC suit?
Well, we actually asked the person that we are working with to do wristband toxin testing for another study, and she said yes. So we are actually going to go ahead and have at least one veteran who offered to pass their suit, pass it, and do that testing. So if other people want to pass theirs on, let us know.
So here's a hypothetical. Would you be able to extract, and if a person were to have gathered sand from the ground, what could that potentially show?
That's an interesting
Asking for
question.
A friend.
So let me just say this, that different chemicals have different, quote, half-lives, meaning how long before they turn into something else or, disappear. And so some chemicals hang around for many decades, and some disappear quickly. But even for some of the ones where they disappear, sometimes what they disappear into are toxic daughter compounds. So, for example, this woman has done studies in areas where there was DDT sprayed 50 years ago. And yeah, the DDT's gone, but she finds when she looks at the soil that there are elevated levels of toxic daughter products of the DDT that nobody ever bothered to look for. So even if the original chemical is gone, there may be other chemicals that are nasty that were produced by the original chemical. So that's one thing.
So
it's interesting about sand.
So asking about that and if they had that sand, wouldn't y'all love to know what's in it?
And the answer is maybe. And I need to understand this a little bit better. But one of the way that people evaluate toxins is for people who are getting ongoing exposure, is through like silica-based wristbands or badges that have silica, which is like sand that's hanging on to the chemicals from the environment. And then that gets analyzed. So I would think that the sand, if that is going to hold on to it, that fine sand, especially the desert sand in the area of like Kuwait, is supposed to be the finest sand in the world, like with individual particles that go down to less than 0.5 microns. And a micron is a millionth of a meter in diameter. And that size is so small that it can actually get into what are called the alveoli of the lungs, and it can carry chemical with it into those alveoli.
So a question about the carrying the chemicals. So my wife and I were talking that long ago. When I came home, she remembers when I came home from the Gulf War, she had picked up one of my uniforms, and she remembers holding on to a uniform, and she remembers getting a rash from the uniform, which I thought was interesting because I'd never heard that before. Now you get a rash, so there's been a transposure of some sort of chemical onto her. I mean, there could be a billion different things, but I mean, I just thought that was interesting. you get a rash. I still have uniforms from when I was there.
Me too.
I mean, some of us had uniforms that we didn't get until long after we were there. Some of us got them before we went there. I mean, there's a lot of variables, but I just,
Sure.
my wife definitely has issues. My daughter has a lot of issues.
Yep.
She was, so.
Is it possible? Is it possible that could have made John's hair fall out?
I will say it actually is possible. We hear after a lot of different chemical exposures that people will report hair loss. Sometimes that goes back. There's a phenomenon, fancy term, telogen effluvium, which basically means your hair falling out a lot. And what happens is your hairs are kind of growing at different phases. There's a growth phase, and then there's a stagnation phase, and then there's a dying phase, and different people have those phases for different lengths. So people who have a longer growth phase will have longer hair. Their hair grows longer before it falls out, whereas people who have a shorter phase, it grows shorter. So
Kevin's just really, he's giving me a hard time through you, Dr. Golumb.
But
I intentionally...
But it is true, because I do remember whenever we came back from Desert Storm. Yep. I remember when I came home and I start developing rashes that go down my back, and they specifically straight on my spine, and I don't understand it. And the doctors are like, "Oh, it's from the heat." I'm like, "Dude, it's like 50 degrees outside."
Yeah, I don't know about that, but I will say we did hear from some Gulf War veterans after the Gulf War that their hair fell out. We're hearing from some people in East Palestine after their train derailment toxin release that their hair is falling out. That is a thing that can happen with any stressor, and part of it, this one way it can happen is called telogen effluvium, which telogen is the death phase. And if all the hairs go in sync in the death phase, then it seems like your hair is all falling out, because it is. But sometimes it will grow back in. Sometimes it'll grow in grayer than when it came out, because if there's like free radicals as part of the chemical that made it fall out, those also affect the hair in the hair follicle. And there's a particular antioxidant called catalase that's important for keeping the hair from going gray, which is a reminder that there's these same free radicals, this quote oxidative stress that's involved in hair going gray in the first place. So
well, it has an effect.
My hair fell out.
This obviously has not affected Sarah, because she's got a full head of hair. It must be a guy thing.
It actually has, but on a different level.
It has.
Right.
My autoimmune disease. I have a lot less hair. I have a lot larger forehead. And I don't grow hair on my legs anymore, so yay me, no more shaving.
Okay.
And so with the East Palestine, that word brings it my next question about that is, what do you find the variables between Desert Storm and East Palestine? Train derailment.
A lot. So it's totally different chemicals: vinyl chloride, dioxins, furans. They, like the burn pits, they burned these mixed chemicals, and then that led to release of more nasty stuff. Like, it turns out that when you burn vinyl chloride, it produces phosgene, which was used as a chemical warfare agent in World War I, and so that led people to be exposed to that. And there are other things with, benzene and, some fuels that were burned, and something called per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, long fancy term. But what they have in common with the Gulf War things is that virtually every one of them can damage those energy powerhouses, those mitochondria, and virtually every one of them can cause oxidative stress. And that the symptoms that we're seeing are mostly the same, except that in East Palestine they have a lot more of the what are called irritant symptoms. Especially early on, they had a lot of burning eyes, burning nose, burning mouth, burning throat. But what we're seeing, including like a lot of similarities, there's a woman that I talked to recently who was there for a month and a half after the derailment, working for one of the companies that was testing the air and water. And she was doing the water testing, so she was pretty exposed because she was using what's called an air knife that basically uses pressurized air to try to stir up the bottom of the creeks to release the chemical so it'll go downstream and then get cleaned. But of course, it's releasing it right on her. And she hasn't been there, since, a month and a half out from February of last year. And now she kind of looks like a Gulf War veteran. She fully meets the Kansas symptom criteria. And just like with Gulf War veterans, a lot of her symptoms evolved after she left the exposure. And before that, she was very healthy. And a lot of the people in the area we're seeing have the same things. They've got cognitive problems. They've got mood problems. They've got GI problems. They've got muscle problems. They've got, skin rashes, diarrhea, just like it's the most common GI thing that we see in Gulf War veterans. It seems to be the most common GI thing there. A lot of them have abdominal pain, headaches, very prominent, just like they're very prominent in Gulf War illness, breathing problems. You might expect that even more there because so many of them were exposed, to the burn products and inhalation. But so they meet a lot of the burn pit, the PACT Act, respiratory conditions that were service connected for burn pit exposed people, the high levels of rhinitis and sinusitis and new onset asthma and bronchitis, which Gulf War veterans also have, but not as much as burn. But, especially the ones that were exposed to burn pits, but that are especially prominent for the burn pit people. So we're hearing a lot of the same problems. And, there's a family that was reported on by the New York Times where the dad, went into heart failure so normally the heart pumps out, over 50% of the blood in the heart at each pump. And that's called the ejection fraction, how much blood is pumped out at each cycle. And I remember we had a call from a Gulf War veteran, maybe, a decade out from the Gulf War, saying that his ejection fraction had gone down to less than 10%, and he was on the heart transplant list. And then his brother-in-law suggested he get put on coenzyme Q10 and selenium, and it actually normalized his ejection fraction in his case. And now we're hearing kind of the same thing. This dad now has an ejection fraction, instead of being over 50%, of 15%, and is really struggling. And that's another mitochondrial injury phenomenon. Heart failure is basically, it means there's not enough energy to the muscle of the heart, and then it can't pump or relax. It actually turns out that the part of pumping that we call relaxing, which is basically the opening up of the heart, takes more energy than the pumping part. So it's not really relaxation.
We've heard so much.
The same thing, like heart failure, seizures, and some of them, like a few Gulf War veterans, seizure rates are elevated in Gulf War veterans, but they're still pretty uncommon.
Very recently, my wife was struggling with some things, and she asked our local provider. So I live in Iowa. She lost. I talked to the nurse briefly, and we're trying to figure out what's going on with my wife. And I asked the doctor. I said, "Can you check?" And I don't know, Dr. Golumb, how much of a deep dive. You very well know how much a deep dive is it to find out if a person's mitochondria is damaged. And my doctor, who actually is a veteran himself, he said, "Hey, even the Mayo Clinic, basically we got a very expensive is what it is, and really nobody wants to dig that deep. So it must be a really deep dive."
If I may interject here, Dr. Golumb, if you could speak to this, what we're seeing in our civilian sector is much the same pattern of behavior with our mitochondria issues within our civilian toxic exposed patients that are 9/11 attacked patients that have COVID vaccine injured, patients with Gardasil vaccine injuries, multitude of other types of toxins. And so speaking with other civilian researchers and doctors, they have come to the conclusion that the mitochondrial issue is exacerbated by the lack of oxygenated blood, which could be why these two individuals that you were speaking to from the New York Times article had such an issue. And what they're seeing is this pattern that of exacerbation is due to this lack of oxygenated blood. And each one of our different patient demographics has a different reason why that lack of oxygenated blood is there. And so our vaccine injured community, it seems to be due to an ITP issue. And what we just saw with the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine that they just pulled off of market was because of that ITP side effect. So have you seen this same pattern of behavior with the lack of oxygenated blood being this catalyst for our mitochondrial issues?
I think I would actually say it's the more, maybe at least as much the other direction or problem, because once you have mitochondrial injury, things like the heart pumping is impaired, and that means the delivery of oxygen is impaired. The breathing can be impaired, but especially what happens is the muscles become weaker, and that includes the upper airway dilator muscles that hold open the upper airway. And so that contributes to higher rates of sleep apnea, and that means there are episodes of inadequate oxygen at night that then become very significant contributors to the problem, and often bigger contributors in a way than the original, the mitochondrial problem if it were not also producing impaired oxygen. There are many different ways that mitochondrial impairment impairs oxygen. Another is that because it leads to release of free radicals, those cause what is called endothelial dysfunction, fancy term for the blood vessels are supposed to normally open up when there's a need for more blood and oxygen. And when there's this fancy term endothelial dysfunction, instead of opening up to allow blood flow, they may even close down when the signals for more blood need are there. And so there's impaired blood flow, which also means less delivery of oxygen. So there are these multiple mechanisms by which once the mitochondria are impaired, it also impairs blood flow. The oxidative stress, that same free radical stuff, also will lead to cell death, which triggers activation of the coagulation system. So there are multiple ways that the damage to the mitochondria then impairs oxygenation, and which amplifies. So the mitochondria take oxygen. Oxygen is a 13-fold multiplier in how much energy you make for every sugar molecule. So every little bit you lower that oxygen is going to magnify that impact a lot.
Wow, you just pumped out a bunch of information that is really every single one of us Gulf War veterans, every single one of us, you just put the nail on the head on. You just hammered it home about the things. Honestly, there's so much you just said in a short amount of time that just exactly states very likely what our problem is, or one of them.
Go ahead, Sarah.
One of them.
Yep.
Go ahead, Sarah.
One thing I heard Dr. Golumb say was free radicals. And anytime we hear free radicals, we think of cancer. And so, as we all know, we're a higher risk for cancer already. Does this put us at an even higher risk, knowing that this potential mitochondria issue causes more free radicals in our body?
Ooh.
I think the answer is yes, because it is known that free radicals are mutagens, and mutagens are carcinogens. It's interesting that the evidence that has come out with Gulf illness is I think the Kamasia exposed people supposedly had higher rates of brain cancer and lung cancer, the ones that were close in. But I've never really seen good quality evidence on overall rates of cancer in Gulf War veterans. So I wish I knew what the risk elevation was, but I don't really know, to be honest.
What about nerve damage?
Yes. So mitochondria are often thought, basically mitochondrial problems are often sort of characterized as neurological problems. And a major reason for that is so the analogy I give is, you got a drought-resistant plant like a cactus, and then you got another, plant that produces abundant fruit and, leaves and so forth, like an avocado tree, and that sucks up a lot of water. Which is going to be hurt more in a drought? The one that, the cactus will be fine, the avocado tree will die. And the same is true for cell energy. What's going to be hurt more when you have impairment in cell energy? It's going to be the organs that need energy the most. And number one among those is the brain. It's about 2% of the body weight. It uses about 20% of the total oxygen for the whole body and 50% of the glucose. So this is this is why the brain, everything from sleep and cognitive function and mood, irritability, all those things are often affected in people with mitochondrial injury. And then also there will often be, quote, toxic neuropathy, peripheral nerve damage, which I think is partly from the, quote, vasonervora, which is basically the blood vessels that supply the nerves, not, being able to, that's one of the mechanisms. Go ahead.
So Dr. Golumb, so is it a difficult task if a physician, if you ask, is it a difficult task to find out if indeed our mitochondria is damaged? Is that difficult to find out?
Super good question with a bit of a complicated answer. The answer is a little bit, it is difficult to find out. I had a patient years ago when I was seeing patients at the VA where I put a massive amount of effort into getting them referred. It took me a year of pleading, et cetera, to get them referred to an outside adult mitochondrial expert at UCSD. And then that particular mitochondrial expert, I don't know if they were an idiot or what, but instead of testing for acquired mitochondrial problems, all they did was tested for the inherited problems she obviously didn't have. There are getting to be more good tests available now, but they're not generally considered like clinical tests that your doctor can usually order. There's a group in Germany, the AONM, which is something like the Association or something of Nutritional Medicine, that has tests, but they're not that easy to get. They've got one set that you can do with just a blood spot, and so that will survive the transit fine. We tried testing for Gulf War veterans using the more complicated one that has to be there within 48 hours. And essentially, when we tried it with a fake blood card that didn't have any blood on it, it arrived fine. But every time we tried it with actual blood on the card from an actual Gulf War veteran, it turned out that there was something like a bank holiday or riots at the postal system. But the good news is we now have like a partner at UCSD who's developing his own test and can do all the same things. So we, for ourselves, can get those measurements very readily. Now, for them to be considered to be clinically usable, and we can get them just from blood. Like when we did our mitochondrial studies, we did one non-invasive test that is not widely available, and that showed impaired energy. And then we did a muscle biopsy test that showed that indeed the severity of Gulf War illness was tied to the degree of mitochondrial dysfunction. Whereas, by the way, inflammation bore no relationship at all. Inflammation was elevated, but it was unrelated. In fact, once you adjusted for the mitochondrial impairment, higher inflammation was tied to less severe symptoms. And I could go through why I think that is, but the inflammation, I think, is a byproduct. In fact, our data showed that the inflammation appeared to be the byproduct of what's called mitochondrial, fancy word, apoptosis, which means programmed cell death. So the mitochondria, when they're impaired, will drive cell death because your body's trying to clear the cells that don't have enough energy to be useful but are still a drain on nutrition and energy resources. And it may be that when that process is more effective, it produces more inflammation that may actually lead the person to be less symptomatic. At least that's what it looks like from that.
Right.
So inflammation wasn't related to the symptoms, but the particular markers of mitochondrial impairment that are known to drive cell death and its resulting inflammation were powerfully correlated to inflammation in the Gulf War veterans only and not in the healthy controls. Like there's something called a correlation coefficient, which is how strongly two things are tied together. And the possible values it can take are from -1 to 1. -1 if they're perfectly anti-correlated, if +1 of this means -1 of that, for example, and then +1 if they're perfectly correlated. And in the Gulf War veterans, these three measures of something called fatty acid oxidation, which is where the mitochondria are using fats as fuels. There's different, measures of mitochondria depending what they're doing. And it's known that when that fatty acid oxidation is impaired, that drives cell death. And the 3 fatty acid oxidation measures correlated with inflammation measured by the typical blood test you can get from your doctor of HSCRP, that stands for high sensitivity C-reactive protein. It's the usually most commonly used marker that your doctor will use for inflammation. The correlation coefficients were between 0.7 and 0.77, which is very high, between 0.7 and 0.8. And in the controls, it was like between 0.12 and I think the highest was like 0.26. So
wow.
Very little correlation in normal people, very strong correlation in Gulf War veterans.
Well, I tell you what, you have answered so many questions right in these last few
and confused you by using too many.
No.
But
what's real good is most of these people will go back and re-listen to this because they should, because people really need to understand. Because the more, like me and Jason have been talking, and the more and more that me and him are looking into environmental stuff and what's going on, like we just stumbled upon, podcast is Popular Functional Medicine Podcast. But the more that we're starting to study and the toxins that's in the air, the more people need to start knowing about it, what toxins are going on and how they may be different, but they can act in the same manners of what's happening to Desert Storm veterans.
Absolutely.
That brings me to my next question, Kevin, for Dr. Golumb. And forgive me if you're not able to answer this, but this is something that our toxic exposure patient demographic, both in the veteran, military service, and civilian sector, have been waiting for quite some time for. All this research, all this data, all this amazing information and knowledge that you've gathered, and yet we have no clinical guidelines, not even throughout the VA, no clinical guidelines that we can even share with our community care program, no clinical guidelines to share with our civilian sector. So when will we be getting clinical guidelines, and have you seen them come across your table? What does that look like on your end? How does that happen?
That's a super
research
good
data
question.
then go to the VA, and the VA takes
Let
care
me
of
answer that in a couple parts.
They have placed all of that on the patient. And in the engagement session we just had a couple of weeks ago, we asked that question: how are we supposed to inform these doctors, and when will the VA be doing so?
With ICD
they put
codes.
It back on the patient, saying you have to inform your doctor. You have to share in the research. Here's your paperwork. Show them what these toxic exposures are doing for you, while these doctors that have 20 years experience or plus are telling us that we're wrong. All the information we're showing them from the VA is wrong, and our diagnosing doctors from risk are wrong.
Right,
so
ICD codes.
Please tell us when we'll be getting the clinical guidelines. And it's not really ICD codes, Kevin. It's more of, this is what you'll see. This is how we do for prevention. This is what you'll see for diagnostics. This is what you'll see for treatment. We need clinical guidelines. When
that's true too.
Happening?
I agree.
Okay, so let me answer that in a few parts. Be careful what you wish for. The VA put out some years ago treatment recommendations for Gulf War illness, and basically they said give them antidepressants. And there was not a shred of evidence that antidepressants were helpful for Gulf War veterans. In a survey study
they did that because, and I was a receiving patient. They did that because they created this off-label treatment protocol, and they claim that these antidepressants were helpful for patients with chronic pain, having no idea that these
sometimes
patients
they can be, but they never tested them in Gulf War veterans and
patients like myself who have autonomic neuropathy and have severe side effects from these medications.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that every psychiatric medication has mitochondrial toxicity, basically. And mitochondrial patients, often it's more important to get them off drugs than to put them on, because when your mitochondria aren't working well, because so many drugs will worsen mitochondrial impairment, patients with mitochondrial problems often do worse with many, many different drugs than normal patients. So in terms of when will guidelines come out, well, and how do you inform your physician? We do have an information sheet that my group prepared, that I prepared basically for patients to hand to their physicians. I'd be happy to share that with you to distribute however you want.
Yeah.
We should make sure we update it because it's probably about a year old by now. So that's one thing regarding whether. So we're also just finally getting ramped up to start our CoQ10 trial. We've been waiting for the manufacturer to send us the product, which hopefully will happen this month, and then we'll be able to get that started. And that particular trial is done with the FDA with what's called an IND, an investigational new drug protocol approved by the FDA. And the purpose of that is that then if the trial is successful, it's showing CoQ10 is better than placebo, then there can be a, quote, indication for use for Gulf War illness. And because we don't have that yet, people say, oh, there's no proof that anything is helpful for Gulf War illness, so we can't recommend anything. So the hope is that that will lead to a clinical indication, and that then hopefully Gulf War veterans would be able to get their CoQ10 paid for, which they cannot currently do by the VA. And then another part of your question, or part of at least part of some of your question, is the ICD code, and how does that interact with this? And that's a super important question also. And you guys, I think we probably talked about how, veterans had been pleading for an ICD code, which is an International Classification of Diseases code that doctors use to say they've got this condition, they've got that condition. We use this code for multiple sclerosis, and that code for, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and this code for, Parkinson's disease. And there is no code for Gulf War illness. And so since nobody else was doing it, I finally said, okay, let's put in the paperwork and propose to the CDC creating such a code. And I got together a group with a few other, doctors and scientists and patient advocates, and submitted the proposal and presented actually in March of last year. And then their process is, at least they accepted they have to agree to accept that you will present the proposal. And then they have a public comment period. And then they had another November meeting that they had me present at again, where the comments came through, and then another meeting this March. And I think, because none of us really knew how this worked, I'd never submitted an ICD code before. But what happens is, at the comment period, even if people are suggesting what they think is a minor addition, and the good news is there was no serious pushback. There was nobody saying, oh, you can't do this, which we were very worried might happen. But there were people who said, well, we should really put this in under an umbrella war-related illnesses code where we can stick other things like Agent Orange. And we should really have both a Gulf War illness code and a Gulf exposure code. And we should put the Gulf exposure code under an umbrella war-related exposures code. And then all those things meant that they had to have another meeting and represent it. And now they're telling us, and this, I can only be grateful that at least they're proceeding with it. But the earliest that the code will be released will be in fall of 2025.
Wow.
So it's interesting. So Dr. Golumb, and Sarah, the three of us, we all know that it's like, how do we treat what the problems and we've all been down different roads. And Kevin and I have talked many times. The only thing really as we speak today is we can treat our symptoms. And what works for one doesn't work for all. And we said that before. And you're familiar with Dr. Garth Nicholson, yes?
Yeah, yep.
Yeah, Dr. Nicholson, as yourself, done a lot of research. And I personally, and I have zero problem talking about what, he was in part with coming up, that NT factor to help me with my fatigue. Because without it, I can't hardly get out of bed in the morning. For me, all of our symptoms, some of us have a lot of the same commonalities, a lot of stomach issues. Like Kevin has a lot of nerve problems. I, knock on wood, don't have the neuropathy like he has to deal with. My symptoms are slightly different, but you got to treat the symptoms. And we understand we're up against, for the lack of a better phrase, a very large machine. And,
big machine, big machine.
So that's why we do what we do, talking to one another, get somebody like yourself who's a professional, and we very much appreciate what you're doing for us. The mitochondria and the conversation we've had about that, for me personally, I've been able to understand because I've read some books that's helped me out understanding what's going on. Those of us who didn't know what mitochondria is and how it affects our bodies, and Kevin, he shook his head when he asked the question, does it affect neuropathy? And you're like, heavens, yes. And that's a big thing. Okay. That's one thing. But it's a huge thing.
But that's something that I learned every time I talk to you. I swear I learned something like 10 things different every time I talk to you, doctor. I'm telling you.
Yes.
And it's amazing how passionate you are about Desert Storm vets, and I love that.
Well, let me say that the Desert Storm vets I've met are some of the best people I have ever met.
Damn right.
I'm constantly impressed by,
damn right,
the goodness, and also the resilience for those of you who are still able to be around to be resilient. You guys are an amazing, amazing group of people, and all of us owe you an incredible debt. Yeah.
But go ahead, Sarah, real quick. Go ahead.
I just add two things. With the ICD code, I hope that everyone is aware that it doesn't just affect the combat veterans, and it certainly doesn't just affect our military and veterans. It affects all citizens. So I'm hoping when they're putting this ICD code, they are thinking of that, and just who else will be using this ICD code, what other medical communities will need to have this information, and we'll be covering all toxic exposures, not just our environmental factors and of war. As we have come from the 90s, we've come very far in understanding what those toxic exposures are. We just have a long ways to go in actually applying those clinical guidelines. But you said earlier about the research you were speaking and about regarding genomes concerning specific individuals that seem to have this pattern. And unfortunately, I erased my notes before because I thought we were already done. But the thing I'm concerned with is, have we yet found the root cause for this? And speaking to this genetic component, is that what you feel that as a result of this genetic variant is why so many people are toxic exposed versus not?
So I guess I would frame it differently. So the genes determine how much the environment will hit you and in what ways it will hit you. So the first level is, okay, what is your exposure and how do the genes affect how exposed you are? And so, and the genes aren't the only thing that affect that. There's even when you're exposed to multiple chemicals together, some of those chemicals will actually block the detoxification systems for the other ones. And to give an example, just with what the most widely prescribed cholesterol drug class are statins, and one of the common ones of those are simvastatin, which used to go by the trade name Zocor, probably still does, but it's now generic. And it's metabolized by a certain pathway. These pathways, these detoxification pathways, are given names, and a lot of them are, I don't know how much to say, fancy word cytochrome P450, which is abbreviated CYP, and then there's numbers and letters that come after that. So the CYP3A4 system is what breaks down simvastatin, or is involved in simvastatin metabolism. And there are a lot of other drugs that can inhibit that system. So an example actually is grapefruit juice actually inhibits that pathway. And this is why people on some drugs should not drink grapefruit juice. Amiodarone is another drug. And there's a study that shows that just having a glass of grapefruit juice before you take your Zocor varies from person to person in how much it affects the blood level. But for some people, it can raise the peak concentration in the blood of that particular drug by over 30-fold, not 30%, 30-fold. So even just that one, essentially it's a chemical interaction between the grapefruit juice does and what that chemical does will magnify the impact of the chemical. Well,
Gotcha.
similarly, there are
Grapefruit
genes.
juice.
Well, I had one
Yeah.
more question then. If that's the
But wait,
hypothesis,
there are genes that will influence gene variants that influence how well you clear a given chemical. And there'll be an enzyme that's involved in detoxifying the chemical, and there will be variants of that enzyme that are less good at it. And so for PB, for clearing PB, the enzyme, that people focus on is something called, butyrylcholinesterase, BCHE. And one of the more common variants is the K variant, and that basically leads to around a 30% less effective clearance. And so it turns out that people who have any of the adverse variants, but the most common of them was the K variant, if they're exposed to PB and have the regular variant, they've got a 2.6-fold increased risk of illness. This is work by Dr. Lee Steele, whom I admire greatly. And if you have the bad variant of the enzyme, the less effective variant of the enzyme, but we're not exposed to PB, you have no increased risk of illness. So you were not predestined to become ill regardless of exposure. But if you have the two together, you have a 40-fold increased risk of illness. So the genes affect the degree to which the environment influences or is toxic to your body. And the first step of that is just how is the drug cleared from the body? And then there are all the other steps. So it's causing, free radical injury. Okay, how are your genetic free radical defenses? And then the free radicals can cause DNA damage. How are your DNA repair defenses? And it can cause that same oxidative stress, those same free radicals can cause autoimmunity. How are your defenses against development of autoimmunity? So that's what we're really interested in with this genetic study, is to look at how all those different pathways that start with the mitochondria and the free radicals that the mitochondria produce, and then go down from that to influence blood flow and DNA injury and autoimmunity. And, as you guys have pointed out, everybody has different symptoms. And some of that is that these different mechanisms are engaged more or less in some people because of their genetics. So that's how that's what we're super interested in looking at in this. And then, Sarah, sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
No, it's fine. What we're going to do, sir, you can keep asking questions, but we're going to go ahead and head into after the show. I want to thank everybody for listening, and stay on the line with me, Dr. Golumb, because I have some personal questions I'd like to ask you, but only in the after the show. But Sarah, thank you for bringing this up today. I think it was great. I learned a lot. And,
I did, yeah, absolutely.
And Dr. Golumb, you're always welcome to come on my show if you need.
Thank you. And you will always probably need to tell me, okay, remember, use simpler words.
And when you were talking about earlier, can you email me that list to bring to doctors, and maybe once you get it updated, and then we'll put it out for everybody. And that way everybody can copy it off. But I want to thank everybody for listening tonight. And now we're going into the after show.